Why this topic? If you're a developer in React, you probably have encountered building forms. Even simple forms like login form, contact form, forgot password form, all of these forms are necessary to build your application. Even if it's like a fancy data visualization, at some point you're going to experience forms. And in my experience, it's kind of difficult because of the way React is built. So let's talk about this topic. First, I'm going to introduce the problem. Then I'm going to complicate it a little bit, talk about potential solutions, and we'll see if there is a conclusion to this whole topic. Spoiler, there is no good conclusion. So here is a simple form. Let's test it out. I hope you can all see it. I'm writing name, John Smith. You can see it's fairly simple, straightforward form. So how do we build something like this? So I'm going to zoom in the code. So if you're doing it the old way with a state, you first define state, basically all the values you need. Then you use that state in certain controls, and then you handle the changes. Straightforward. If you're using hooks, the new cool thing, it's slightly similar, but better, because you can do 3 things in one. So you can define the initial value, you can get the value, the current value, and actually get the setter, and then use it the same way as before. So is that complicated? Well, according to some people, yes. And I find this image really close to heart. I'm not sure if you can agree. By laughs, I think you agree with that. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the topic we are discussing, albeit very simple, has complexity under the hood. We have, at the beginning, and it's going to get complicated, we have 3 things. We have the initial value, which is usually an empty form, or if you're doing like edit form, you have the previous state of that comes from database or a microservice or whatever. Then you have to update the values, which is kind of repetitive, and you will see it later in more details. And also using the current value, which means destructuring and passing on. There's a lot of boilerplate, and boilerplate is never fun. Okay, so when we are developing stuff, we like to simplify. So how do we simplify code? Well, we extract everything in small components. So this satisfies the previous code example quite well. We basically extracted and simplified the input control to 3 properties we used. It's a label, so it's helpful. There is value, the current value, and there is onChange function. And when you use it, it's slightly less easier than before. You can easily see how adding multiple such controls to form scales up pretty well. And you can argue that this event handler could have been written so that we extract the e-target value in the control itself, so simplifying even further. But I digress. We have a new thing, placeholder, which we missed before. So why is that significant? Placeholder is something that comes from DOM, and we're trying to use DOM as much as possible because it's native, it's accessible, we actually want to use all the features we have, and when we are abstracting things, we are actually, what abstraction means, we are actually hiding things that we don't care about. But we're going to introduce new things all the time. So let's scale up. This is a new form for ordering some things and then delivering to home. So we have a quantity, how many things we want to buy. You're going to fill the first name, John Smith, email at .com, and then an address. Okay? And then send. So that's a simple form, right? How did we scale up from that code to this code? This is the new code. Can you read it? No. Let's zoom in a little bit. So the state has increased. For every field, we have at least 1 new data, and that's not necessarily always the case. Sometimes we can have more than 1 state field for a visible control. We are actually now introducing a new input type. It's a number. And number is slightly different. It's not just pure text, obviously. So you have to define minimum values, maximum values in step function. Because, for example, when you're ordering stuff online, you can't order 1.1 things. In certain cases, if it's a kilos, yeah. But if you're ordering in quantity, you need to lock it to 1. And you can also notice there is a parseInt here. So now the set state becomes non-trivial because we actually have to convert the text to number. Okay, let's carry on. We're going to use max length on this input because we want to limit the first name to 10. So I guess some people that are having longer names cannot order things online. And if we want to use email types for inputs when we are inputting email, why? Because of accessibility, screen readers, and just general semantics. And we also can use built-in validation that's built into the DOM model. So how can we use this? I'm going to just go back to the form so you can see it in real life. If I go up there is no number above 5. I cannot go lower than 0. If I'm clicking cursors on my keyboard, you can see that it's increasing by values of 1. If I delete those things and I put invalid email and click submit, you'll see that I actually got a browser telling me that this email is not. So we get lots of cool benefits from just marking our fields with correct attributes. And you can see that required is also respected by the browser. OK, so why is this significant? Because this complexity obviously plays against the previous simplification, right? We now, when we actually handle the input, we have to support it. OK, so before we actually tackle the simplification in the code, let's do one more thing. Let's connect it to a fake web service, right? So when I click send, nothing happens. Can anybody tell me why nothing happened? Can you take a guess? That's a good catch. Any other takers? Of course. And we don't know, right? It's really hard to debug. So what's the problem with this thing? Let's try ordering something like 3 things. Oh, server fail. OK. Let's order less things than that. So, oh, it just took me a while. Well, if I click this multiple times, I'm probably going to crash my browser. OK. So there is a problem with asynchrony, is that it also complicates our forms. So why? Because as you saw, there is no indication that I clicked, that something's happening, that it's done. What kind of done state? Is it like success state? Is it error state? Can I fix the error? Is it irrecoverable error? There is no indication in the UI, right? So let's handle this. I'm going to click on send button here. And you can see it's now disabled. And it's coming to life. Well, not working. Skip. So let's see what we added to the code. So first of all, we are adding something new to the state, and it is the state of the transaction. That's no longer the state of the form in itself. This is something above and beyond form. So we are now polluting a little bit our state with these additional things like resending. Was there an error? We'll see that later on. So we also have to mark our input field, that submit field, with disabled attributes, so they can disable it. So you cannot click it 10 times to get 10 requests sent to server. And we also, when handling it, now we have to say, OK, we now started. We need to properly address the error states. And as you can see, this is quickly, for the small form, and you can imagine if it's just 1 field as opposed to 4 fields, it's a lot of code to write, and it's also very, very repetitive. So let's recap. So what are our forms made of? So they are made out of presentational material, like names, labels, positioning, so how they look on the screen. They have state management for the values, which can get really complicated when you think about it. When, for example, if you're doing a date range picker, you have to have min date, max date, and when you change the min date, obviously the max date cannot be, the second date cannot be before the first date. You have dependent validation. If you have a checkbox that turns off half of the features, you need to properly address it in the UI. So this is all problematic. You need to handle the async state. You need to handle basic validation. And there is more to come. And you can see now that our original example has grown a little bit because we just keep piling on attributes into this input, because we want to handle all these special cases. And you can see that I'm missing the min, max, required, disabled, read-only. So if I keep adding all these properties to this cool and abstract input control, I'm basically re-implementing the input control. So, am I really improving my design? Is it becoming complicated? What's the point of abstraction if it's just indirection, right? And further on, what we can do is just use the spread operator. So we can just identify the interesting things to really abstract over the structure. So we identify that the class name is important as the root of our presentational object, right? You can say the children are important so that they're not spread in the input field. We have ID, which is really important. A label goes into label, and everything else goes to input. So we kind of are now faking it because we are hiding all these additional attributes that we are sending to input. And from the perspective of usage, nothing's changed. So if I go back and forth, the usage is literally the same, but our control the abstract control is simpler. But I'm not sure if you could argue that this simplification is not really helping, because you didn't gain much. It's really hard to document all the possible aggregations you could use for this feature. So let's talk further about validation. We have several forms of validation I'm going to address tonight. So we have the built-in validation on DOM level. You've seen that before. It works even if you turn off JavaScript, which is nice. You have the custom field validation, which you do manually for things that are non-trivial, like regex validation, custom validation for your software. That's really hard to pull off without custom JavaScript code. You have the asynchronous validation that's coming from server. Once you hit the server and the server responds back, it's going to say you might have an issue in your form, and that's actually more common than a success state. So you have to properly address those errors. You can either display all of them in one bunch, or you could tie them to a particular field. Because if you're saying that, I don't know, username is invalid, you want to show that message next to the username field, not at the bottom or the top of a large form, right? If you have like 40 fields, you don't want to have 40 error messages in one place. And there is also the entire form validation when you're trying to verify that the entire state actually makes sense from the perspective of business case. So let's see some client validation. So this field is always going to be OK, no matter what I type in it. This field is eager to tell me that, this field is even more eager. So if I press U here, it's going to say we don't like you. So no one likes you, I guess. So if I remove you, it's now working. And you can create bugs really easily, because if you, for example, type U here, it's not validated yet. It's validated on submit field. And because of how I define things, I might actually disable submit button. Why did I disable submit button? Because I want to prevent sending data to server if it's invalid. But then I went in and overcoded this and went into deadlock because of basically bad coding, which you can get yourself really into if you're trying to handle all these cases in the same piece of code. So let's see how we actually did this validation. So first of all, we created, zoomed in. So this is a special control for displaying errors, just to simplify things. So now our state gets additional properties. It gets error properties. In this case, it's just a basic string, but you can imagine it can be an array of strings. It can be severity along with just the string, because you can say, OK, this is a warning. You're not supposed to do this. Or it can be an error. You cannot proceed if you have these things. And also, we don't support success states, because there is no type here. So if you want to actually mark a field green when it's filled properly, you also have to create additional fields for that. So this is a simple usage of this error field. So as you can see, now I have field, I have the setter, and I have the errors. And what I did there in the example, I performed two different kinds of validation. One was on submit, one was on blur. So in certain cases, you actually want to validate once the user input leaves, the user focus leaves the input box. In certain cases, you want to do it afterwards. In other cases, you want to do it on server, then notify back. And when the server says that this, when you have, for example, have a required field, when do you clear the error message, right? So you need to handle all these blur states. You're going to see later on in the actual framework libraries that do these things, they have this concept of pristine values, and has this control been touched before? Because managing this in a straightforward manner, and this is all basically a UX issue, is really hard, and it's really not something easy to think about. And now you see that we have the on blur event. So do I put that back into the really simple input control? I don't think so. And this is the can submit, because I actually want to disable submitting if state is invalid, right? But then I lock myself into, because field 2 is actually really special, and I can validate it afterwards. So I'm mix and matching my validation. And then you can see that this code becomes really repetitive. It's really repetitive. I'm not sure how to simplify it. So where does this mess come from? From my perspective, it comes from UX. I'm not saying that UX is a bad thing. Actually, it's a good thing, and it's actually telling us how to do things so that they work. And all these problems are not problems with the code. They're actually problems with how we are addressing the issue at hand. And the issue at hand is filling a form and submitting it. And more than often, you actually have to correct people or to display warnings, success messages or similar. And all of these things become problematic and hard to deal with in a systematic way. But we do want to do it in a systematic way. Why? Because we're building large applications. Large applications tend to repeat their state. Even before you get into the application, you have at least 4 forms. It's a login form, it's a register form, it's a forgot password form, and also confirm that you forgot password form, and possibly a reset password form. So without entering the application, you already have 5 instances where this code becomes boilerplate, and you just don't want to repeat yourself. And if you think of a cool new UX approach, you have to copy-paste it 5 times over. So you really want to do it in a systematic approach. And last but not the least, the server-side validation. That's the validation when you get something from a server, you need to tie to UI. In certain cases, it's field-specific, as I mentioned before. In that case, you tie the error to the appropriate field, which means that you have to name the fields on the client and on the server the same way, so you can actually reconcile them, usually by giving them the same name, or just like lowercase, uppercase variant, which is sometimes annoying because you have to match it really tight. Or in case of general error, because some errors are really not tied to a particular field, you need to display them in like a general place, like usually below or above the form itself. So in this simple case, I'm going to fake a network response and say that if there is an A in the name, this is all simple errors, but you can imagine like username being taken or password, email not found or something similar. So Jens, let's use, like this will actually work. Yeah, done. Now it works. So we can see that if you want to tie I mean, this is a fake contrived example, but you can see that I really want to take into account the location, or the collocation of the error next to the UI, right? Okay, let me switch back. So to recap, once again, our forms are a mix of all of these things. As we mentioned before, presentation. We want to do state management, we want to do the asynchronous state management, we want to do the validation of the client, the server validation, we want to tie all this, we don't want to repeat ourselves, we want to be simple, we want to be reusable, and it's really hard to do so in my experience, and no matter what you try, you're going to tie yourself into a knot here. So in theory, what do we want? We want to describe our UI or our business logic in a stateful manner or a rule-based manner. So in this case, let's just imagine for a moment that this is what we are actually building. We have an input of email, and the type of input can be string, number, email, color, geo coordinates, whatever. And we have defined rules. We require an email. Also, we want to supply the email a regular expression, so that we validate that also the email is well formed. It's not a fake, just string. We also want to limit, in this case, it's just contriving example. We want to limit the field input to 50 characters. Quite simple, right? So how do we transform something like this into real UI? I'm not a big fan of generating UI from rule-based systems. I'm not sure how you feel. Does anybody like generating UI from JSON structures? A couple of people? Okay, we can take it afterwards. But because that also becomes messy, the main point or the main benefit of using something like React is that it's really simplifying how you write your UI. And UI is mostly presentational, so we can actually say that you're polluting your presentational layer with all of these the actionable things, like how do you handle input, how do you handle errors, how do you handle the state of the system, do you want to display on your form that, for example, the internet connection is not available. That might be really useful if you're like deep down in some forms, like in your CMS, and you're really wanting to send something to server, and actually there is no internet connection, so you want to display like a bar, like in Messenger, there is no internet connection. That might be significant. Or if you know that the service is unavailable, do you want to display that in the UI? So those are the considerations you have to like take into account when actually building complex UIs, because for some users, it's really helpful to know that before debugging, basically, by testing the Google.com. So what are the general approaches towards solving these kind of problems? I'm going to mention a couple of problems. I'm going to go through some public libraries that are tackling this problem. So one way is to just create a bunch of basic elements, like text input, password input, number input, similar. I tend to use controls like text input and password input rather than having an input with all the possible variations. It simplifies things. It's a little bit duplicate, but then again, it really narrows down the point of control. As you've seen before, the number input has the min, max, and step fields, which are basically not necessary for example, text input, because you have max length there. So it's better to separate these things and copy-paste code than to just like stuff 20 unrelated attributes on a single control. The second thing is I'm going to show a small example. You can actually rewrite your UI on the fly, which is really fun but dangerous and effectively slow and doesn't play nice with other libraries. Or you can use the generic field components with custom renderers that actually, that's used by some libraries, that actually simplify your definition of a form. So your form definition in React looks more like that JSON I posted before, and the rendering is decoupled and put elsewhere. So you describe your form in generic terms like, this form has 5 fields, and they're validated. Problem with, in my experience with this kind of approach, is that you will find that one control and then the second control which doesn't conform, and then you have so much custom coding, so much custom escape routes that it's not really useful, and all these like ifs just add up. So one cool way of doing this with the children rewrite. So let's say we have a class called binding context which has initial and current data, and one magical function set, which sets the properties on this state. It can handle like Lodash nested properties like address dot line 1. It can handle numbers correctly. It can handle text areas, handle email if input fields, checkboxes, whatnot. And then you describe your UI in just like a couple of simple controls. This appears very simple, and name is here used to actually. Name is in this case the name of the property, or actually the variable in the state, so everything's kind of generated from it. This is really useful for generic CRUD applications like admin interface or something where you just want to spew out quick forms for quick input without messing with the UI. And if you just have a sequential UI that has proper paddings, it's good enough. But it breaks down on, like I said, complex examples, because if you want to have like a map picker here, or you want to have like a color picker, all these special controls quickly bleed out and make things unmaintainable. So how would something like this work? I'm not telling you to use this. This is a hack I tried based on some tweet posts I found. If you like it, you might try to experiment. So basically, binding context is the magical component that rewrites all this UI by injecting the current state value and injecting the onChange handler. So it's really, really simple. It just transforms all the children, and it basically, if it's not a string, if it's a proper component, it injects the data and the set function that's basically here, right? Data and set. And the transform children is a simple recursive function that goes through the whole UI tree. And one really good example where React framework shines is the ability to actually get to the UI tree in runtime, modify it, generate new UI tree, which actually is rendered properly, and everything works. However, this is really dangerous, because if you start using such transformations, you don't know who else is it composable, does the order matter, are you going to run into some memory leaks? It's really problematic from a long-term perspective. So in my experience, there are third-party libraries that handle this somewhat nicely. Your mileage may vary, depends on your usage. All of these libraries were made up for a particular scenario. Basically, people had large applications, and they needed to handle these problems in a systematic fashion. This is by no means the exhaustive list of all the libraries out there, but there's a couple of famous ones. Just going to go through it to show you how they decided on the same problems that I showed you earlier. So Formik, in this case, has a bunch of built-in components that mimic the form field relationship, as I've told you in the previous list of solutions, and also like generic error message. So in this case, you have these basic controls which you use to describe your form in a straightforward manner. You have in this case, like initial values, so that's where you initialize the form. It's either default values for new form or existing values from database. Then the actual render function, you can see you have the form, and then it's field, error message, field, error message, field, error message, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of looks similar to the previous thing I've done, and it's doing the same thing under the hood. And you can see that it's not using the children, it's using a render prop. So if you're like a fan of this approach, it's nice. And if you say field type email, it's going to render input with type email. If you are requiring some complicated, like maybe double inputs or date picker or something else, which is not supported natively by input from DOM, then in that case, you can actually supply your own renderer and actually escape the hatches and render. But when you are doing that, you have to respect everything that Formik expects you to respect, and that's the proper naming of the values, the proper naming of the change handler. So in those cases, you actually are expected to learn how the framework actually works on the hood, so that so you can actually extend it when necessary, and it's going to be necessary immediately when you leave this, like the good land of just like input boxes with numbers and text. I'm not sure if anybody has built like a fully functional application that's sold for good money that only has string and text and number and email input. So that's non-trivial input. And you see that they also handle things like can I submit? They handle validation in a systematic manner, which is basically convention they decided upon. And you can see that in this case, it's also kind of boilerplatey. Not sure if I don't really like it that much. I don't like any of these libraries because, first of all, I didn't write them, so I have to learn them. And if I would write them, I'd write them probably the same way, just name things differently. Because that's the most important part, right? To name things your way. So how the Redux form? I mentioned this because do people use Redux nowadays? Yeah, less and less people use Redux nowadays. So Redux form does similar thing, but it wraps everything with so much magic. I don't really agree with this philosophy because Redux should not keep a transient state like form state in Redux anyway. So you can see that it's similar approach, right? It's using the native form control, but it's also defaulting to like generic field inputs, and it also supports render field when you actually need to render something, customly, and it requires so much basic understanding of how the framework works. And you can see that this was what I mentioned earlier. It has the concept of touched. Why? Because that's like, have I entered this control? Because your validation and the display validation might depend on that. Because, for example, if you have a form with 20 input fields, and you just like fill one and click submit, it's going to say like, well, actually, these 3 controls are required, and it's going to highlight those with the red button. If, for example, let's imagine that those controls really have required value. So you go into the control, for example, it requires password. You fill the password, click tab, you leave the password field. So you have now successfully fulfilled this like success condition. So do I now remove this validation, or do I retry it again because the password might be too short, it might be not matching with the confirmed password. So all these things like leaking quite quickly in whatever abstract solution you've chosen. And that's something which is basically a UX consideration, which in the end you probably want to do because the application is performing nicely from the user perspective. And you can see that we have something like pristine state. You can reset the form in case of like a user not happy with the feature. Maybe it's an edit form and you want to reset to the original values because you're not sure if you change things correctly. So there are all of these design choices vary from library to library. You might find that one library has a use case that you like but doesn't have the other use case. So you'll have to build it yourself in the end, so that's kind of a bummer. And when you're doing validation, it has its own way of doing errors. I don't know, it looks similar to before, but if you have dashes in your choice of variable names, then you can't really use the built-in JavaScript things, built-in JavaScript property names, because in theory you could use bracket syntax and quotes inside to name it like data-min, data-max. You actually have to go into camel case and write data with capital M, min, capital max, right? Finally, the one I kind of like because it's modern, it's fresh, it's recent, it's based on hooks, and you're going to hear all about hooks in the second session today. It's somewhat it's similar to previous libraries, but it uses less of custom controls. Everything's built by you, but there is a small caveat there. So you basically have two things that you import from the whole library, which is nice, less things to learn, right, I guess. So use form is the entire form, use field is for each individual field. In this case, when you're creating form, okay, this is looking better on a 69-inch screen, but you can imagine that here it says something and here it says something. So basically, this is construction of form with default values, and it gives you back the actual form, the submit function, the current values, again, pristine from before. Is like the form like clean and just entered, or is it already validated at least once? Am I submitting right now so I can disable the button, right? And then you have two fields in this case, just first name and last name. They're based on forms, so they are, so basically you get fields here. And now let's see how they actually use this in a real form. So using only the built-in input and all built-in DOM elements from DOM. You don't use any custom like field or form, whatever. But this thing that bothers me, like you're splatting everything that's in this firstname.input. So what's in firstname.input? Google it, go to docs, right? You cannot find out. It's just splatting everything, and then you override with placeholder. So am I oversplatting or what? Yeah, that's all the problems of using libraries without understanding them, but that's a different topic. And you also can see that, for example, you want to disable if it's a pristine state, so that means you haven't entered anything, or we are actually, submitting, so we disable it while doing asynchronous operations. So I'm not sure, like, what's your takeaway here? Like, all these libraries solve the same problem in a slightly different manner. The choice of your problem varies with the choice of a library, and the best way is to build it yourself, because then at least you know what you're controlling your use cases in a more right way. But I still think that you need to build something in a systematic way. Otherwise, every component is going to look different. The naming of error fields is going to look different depending on probably developer or team that built that form, and that's not good because later on it's really hard to understand the code. It's really you want to have a systematic UX approach to things. So if you do error validations on one form, you want to do them all the forms the same way, with the same style of errors, with the same reasons for errors appearing and also disappearing in the case of, for example, clearing the badly written input. So you need to really do something. You might build it yourself or base it on top of an existing solution, or just read the source code of something like final form hooks and build it yourself, right? Okay. So what's my conclusion? Forms are hard, and if you think I'm just talking about typical forms like just 20 input fields, basically like government forms, it's not really that. The problem that we are facing is basically managing the state, presentation of the state, and also handling all the error cases. That will happen if you have like 10 spinners on screen and you're trying to adjust them, if you're simulating a gramophone or whatever. If you have input from user and you're syncing it to the state and then you're validating it, you're going to have the same problem no matter how you actually render it in UI. So this is actually the hard problem. Is how do you manage state? How do you use it, and how do you do it in a systematic way so that given a large application you're not lost or surprised at every corner. All solutions to this problem are complex because the problem itself is complex. If you have simple problems, then your solutions are going to be simple. If you have complex problems, obviously there are no simple solutions. You just have to decide on something, and you have to standardize on something, possibly document it well, or make it self-documented, so it has a good name, so you can at least understand it just by reading, and also follow good UX practices. Because if you think about it, I could have just made the first form, fill whatever you want, click submit, and just display one red box. Sorry, wrong. But that's not really useful, and that's not going to sell your application nowadays. So in those cases, you actually are following the good UX practices of how to build a UI that's usable for every user. That means accessible, understandable, and approachable by all users. So that's my conclusion. There's no happy path. I'm not giving you a library. Just use this, especially not my own. So please don't use my libraries. So with that, I want to thank you, and if you have any questions, I will take them now. Let's see how much time I have. I have 10 more minutes, actually. So, yes?
So if you build a form with any of those libraries, how do you handle unit testing? Do you trust the form's authors that the validation works as intended, or do you actually test stuff?
Well, it's a third-party library. I'm not sure what's your internal process for something like that. I would assume it's tested, especially because if it's a public library, it's probably been tested by simultaneously multiple teams in the world. So everything that's a problem for you, it's probably a problem for somebody else. You're rarely a unique snowflake, right? The thing I would recommend in that case is to go to GitHub issues page to see how quickly they address these issues. Because even if somebody finds this issue before you, if they are there for for 4 months, it's not really a good sign, right? But yeah, it's a really good problem. But this is a general problem with third-party dependencies. You kind of trust them, I guess. Yes.
I think the more interesting talk on forms is if you're working on a project or in a company and you need to build forms, there's often a tendency to have this pitfall idea of we can build this stuff ourselves. And then you start building forms yourself, and you have this, provide your own system for building forms that only exists in your company. Instead of investigating like you did, the Formik, the Redux form, and the final form system, find out what fits you best and where it comes short, and contribute to that form system so it will, fill the gaps that you need to build the forms you need to build. And a lot of companies are doing that wrong and start building their own form systems, and then you end up being a form building company inside the company instead of building the value you actually need to build, right? I've seen this a couple of times in different companies.
And then it makes it harder to learn the new framework, and also it's not reusable in elsewhere. Actually, Formik started out as an internal solution that they used in their system, and they just open source it. So typically what people do is at least show it to the world, so somebody else will fix the bugs, I guess.
I'm sure e-conomic has a form system as well, but maybe it's not open source, or maybe you're switching to an open source software as well.
Let's take that afterwards. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that.
What?
You're scratching our wounds right now.
We are building it.
With the hooks version that you showed, with the hooks, from my understanding, you can only set state on one variable at a time. So when you want to clear out the form at the end, they have a solution for that?
In that case, I'm not sure. Let's see if it's mentioned here. No, but it's probably easy to add. It's probably just a callback here that internally, because this hook is just basically a glorified object.
Yeah, but the reference to I guess in this one you're not really making the hooks there on your functional component. So yeah.
So like one trick to clear states is just to change the key.
Oh.
Components. So I'm not sure how that works with hooks.
So we have a parent component that has keys bouncing downwards, and then you reset it by changing the key and re-renders everything. Yeah, that might work. It's internal knowledge how hooks work, so if you didn't catch it, once you start using hooks, it's going to be evident. Yes?
So what do the big guys do? Like, what does Facebook do?
Oh, that's a good question.
There must be some huge companies that have solved this, and there must be many of those. But probably they solved it for their purposes, but still.
Yeah, but I cannot really answer that question. I can imagine that, like as a colleague already mentioned, everybody's building their own system because they have a really unique original solution to handling numbers in an object. So, what I've seen is that all these solutions are half-baked, and when working with other companies or on freelance projects, all these things are unique and custom-built, and they resemble something you've seen elsewhere, but it's not something. As for what Facebook uses, I'm not sure if they use anything systematically because they have a different strategy overall. Because I was actually looking at their repositories and comments by Dan Abramov, how they actually structure their code. It's really strange. I don't think it's scalable for anybody except Facebook. So, and also depends on what kind of application are you building. Is it really a form system, like a master detail CRUD system, or is it something more like data visualization? It depends on those things, but in the end, it's going to boil down to the same basically set value, read value state.
I know Redux form is primarily built by Rasmussen, one guy, and I think there's kind of a community around it now, but primarily one guy, actually a Danish guy. So I don't think there's big companies behind all these solutions.
If that, yeah,
Yes. So, I would also encourage people to look into like how are people solving this problem in like other languages. And I'm like super biased, like running the Reason ML community and like, building stuff in Reason. But I found one library there called Reformality, and it's kind of tackling pretty much all of these issues in a like pretty elegant way. So yeah, like try to look into like other languages, and it's not like a new problem.
yeah, definitely.
Someone must have found like something.
The problem is that everything is like custom. I can actually recall I was working, I think, 10 years ago on WPF application for they're basically creating test beds for internal combustion engines, and their system is like a large WPF application which has like 100 forms because you're basically adjusting variables for different parts of the engine. It's technical, it's hardware, and all these forms are generic. They have like 10 inputs with sometimes like dependencies between them because it's basically the speed of a gear or something like that. So they generated almost all of their forms, and by almost all, there are 5 forms which were actually built by hand because they're so custom and was impossible to generalize. But everything else was built on this custom framework, which basically generated the whole UI from schema. So you have a schema in database, in XML, of course, and then you basically go to the XML and generate UI on the fly with everything, with validation. I mean, you have obviously the validation rules. It's not code in XML, but the layout, the number of things, the dependencies, it's built by this custom framework. So, like for those kind of like generative approaches, you can actually generate everything from like a rule-based system, which I described in that like fake JSON, when you actually can describe a large number of forms that vary in size depending on user. Like if you're building SAP or Salesforce, you cannot build like a form. Your form depends on 10 different feature flags, 10 different settings, modules, licenses, and also what you enable in your UI. So basically everything's dynamic. In those kind of approaches, you basically build your UI dynamically anyway.
But in situations like that Redux form, where it stores all its data in Redux, could gap between, dependencies on different form elements.
Oh, yeah, I can agree to that, especially if you use Redux in localized manner. So it's not really global, it's kind of like local just for this form, yeah. But still a lot of boilerplate, yeah. Any more questions?
Why not to disassemble form into the fields and have fields as a micro component?
You mean fields as in custom, like capital F fields, or like input?
No, like you create your own form contains a lot of fields, so you create your own, for example, for password.
Mm-hmm.
And you have it as a micro component which you store as a separate library. Whenever you need, you pull it in and you add. And why not to choose the approach? Because I feel like some of the fields you can generalize them. So like free text, email, and so on. Why not?
Yeah, I can actually try to go back. I actually have a problem with that approach from personal experience. Where is the simplification? The idea is that, for example, in this case, when you are doing input and next to it some kind of glyph, like for success, error, or in this case, in like text below, then like you can argue, should I use div here or I don't know, fragment? What if I want to display things in a tabular form or in a grid form? No matter what you decide, there's going to be that one form where things are not like playing nice, and then you do a lot of hacks. So the reason why I want to do all these things is to localize all the possible variations above just the mere input, right? With the presentation, so that like all the labels are aligned correctly, or the inputs are, for example, left aligned vertically. So for these cases, you want to have a slightly more decoration around the actual control which you are using. And the problem is that if you're putting that in a micro library framework, whatever, then if you're happy, if you're okay with duplicating, then I think it's a good approach, because you can, people usually try to achieve 100% generalization, which is nearly impossible in any non-trivial application. And if you are happy with like 90% of application is generic and we're going to use these 10 controls, then awesome. And then those 10% just custom render, right? And if something changes, you paste all the changes correctly to the entire application. But the problem is always when you're trying to do 100%, and then in that case, this label, when put in a dialog next to like map picker, it's not going to scale. So that's the problem with which I have when you're saying I'm going to use this in a like a micro library or micro component. Did that answer your question? I feel it is, but